easy, stinging clear.
The day after I turned 16, I went for my learner driver's permit. After weeks of doing practice tests and thinking I had studied hard, I did the 32-question computer test at Vic Roads, our version of a DMV. And after completing the test, I was extremely confident I had passed. I knew it probably wouldn't have been by much, but I was sure I had my learner permit. I got the results back, 69%. The pass mark was 74. I had failed by just a few incorrect answers. Devastated, I burst into tears on the way home and slammed my bedroom door shut when I got back. This is where my long and complicated journey with driving began.
Whatever tomorrow brings, I'll be there. It's driven me before, and it seems to have a vein haunting mass appeal.
Right before I turned 16 and did the computer test that fateful day, I was super excited to start driving. I wanted to rack up those driving hours through my final years of school and then get my license in my last year of high school just like my brothers did, so I too could drive myself to school. My brother booked the learner's test for me. He encouraged me to start driving when I was legally able to, and I was excited to get going. But after that traumatic experience of barely failing my test, I refused to hear the words Sam and driving uttered for the next 2.5 years. I had, in a sense, rage quitted. I let one bad experience stop my young adult life from starting rather than trying my best to forget about what happened and try again. I hated that stupid computer test you have to do in order to get a learner permit. I hated it all. I never wanted to think about driving a car again, but along with my hatred for computer tests came my hatred for the status quo. I went from being super excited to start driving when I turned 16 to hating everyone else for doing their hours and getting their driver's license. I deemed them as sheeple who just followed everyone else in the status quo. I thought it was a dumb and superficial thing that everyone wanted to get their license just to drag race one another at 200k's in their white BMWs their parents picked out with them on their 18th birthday. I was unable to realize the freedom that came with driving, and for my last few years of school, I had zero interest in even attempting to drive.
Ask myself how much I let the fear take the wheel and steer.
Everyone will know that when you put off doing something, you know you've got to do. A something which potentially could involve some level of risk to your safety. This something you put off doing eventually becomes some form of a fear. Now, I wasn't terrified of driving. I was excited to start, remember? However, I had let it go for so long that the idea of me driving the car became extremely foreign. After years of putting off driving, it had become something I could no longer picture myself doing. I was starting to wonder just how uncomfortable I'd become with the thought of driving a car. And then the longer I went without driving, the further I drifted away from actually seeing myself holding a license and literally going places. The best example of this feeling I had was when I finally went for my learner permit again, just a mere 2.5 years after I first went for it. I was ready to do that same dreaded computer test again as Mum dropped me off at Vic Roads. She then quickly drove off for a pressing appointment, but it turned out I had the wrong proof of identity credentials. No matter how many times I tried calling everyone I knew who drove, nobody answered. I just gave up and started walking home. I ended up walking about 6 kilometers and 3/4 of the way home before I finally got a hold of Dad and he picked me up. During this long walk by a highway, I realized the full extent of just how much of a loser I was for not having a car, a license, not even a learner's permit. Everyone else I knew was moving forward and I was stuck. I felt the feeling of regret. Regret that I didn't move on from my failure when I was 16 and instead waited until I was 18 and a half to go for my learner permit. But alas, nothing changed. I didn't like the thought of driving and I still didn't have the drive. That lack of motivation remained, and the experience of walking 6 kilometers just made me feel angry at how, in my mind, the universe didn't want me to drive. I felt like I just fell even farther away from ever having my own license. I also felt extremely angry at having another awful experience trying to get just my learner permit, and this also made me passionately not want to bother even more than before. 2 weeks later, I got my learner permit. I had passed that dreaded computer test by a few percentage points. However, my recent experiences and anger toward how difficult it felt for me to be able to drive meant that it would be yet another 1.5 year time span until I would even drive a car for the very very first time. Not long after I first drove a car, I then gradually did some driving. That period of driving everywhere, with mum and dad supervising, lasted only 5 weeks before I once again lost the drive and stopped for another year and a half after that. I did just roughly 10 hours of driving in that time. I had completely let the fear take the wheel and steer.
So if I decide to waver my chance to be one of the hive.
I remember every summer for years my friends would constantly tell me to get my license. They would drive sometimes ridiculous distances just to pick me up from my place. I always tried my best to thank them as much as I could and buy them food and other things in exchange for driving me literally everywhere. It was insane how often people would come and pick me up from my place. I vividly remember every time there was only one mate living in my area who could lift me somewhere, that person would do it. The guilt for me not being able to drive my friends anywhere, but also them feeling like they had to drive me everywhere, didn't make me feel all that great. It was just far too convenient for me. I remember it being so ridiculous once that even when I was at a party far away from my place and my mate couldn't get a hold of me, he still drove to my place, took a photo of the front of my house and sent it to me. I remember thinking, damn, even when I don't respond, my mates are still driving to my place to pick me up. It honestly felt ridiculous, and no matter how much I thanked them, I still felt like the biggest leech ever. And of course, every time someone told me to get my license, I felt a massive cloud of shame fall over me. At the same time though, I had this stupid idea of, I want to get my license even less the more that same person nags me about it. If that's all that person thinks of every time they see me, then screw them. In reality, at the time, I really couldn't fully grasp just how massive an inconvenience it was for my friends to have to pick me up and drop me off all the time. Other friends would kindly ask me to try my best to get my license, and that was when I sort of understood the massive inconvenience and felt that shame for not trying hard enough. But that one person saying it to me every single time we'd hang out just ended up annoying me. The lack of options with not being able to go anywhere and my friends having to drive me literally everywhere still wasn't a big enough factor for me wanting to get moving and finally get my license. No, the real push would occur a little bit later.
Lately, I'm beginning to find that I should be the one behind the wheel.
When people regret not doing something, they go one of two ways. They either wallow in that regret and let it bother them, or they use the regret to fuel them not to make the same mistake twice. In some cases, what drives people to achieve their goals is that realization that although they have wasted years of not attempting to achieve a life goal, it doesn't mean that it can now never be done. Rather than forget about a past mistake, some people use that mistake to serve as an example of what their life will continue to be if they don't do what is necessary to rectify the situation. I was stuck at home in lockdown for just about all of 2020. That was when I really felt it. I couldn't go anywhere with my friends. I couldn't even go anywhere by myself. I was constantly stuck at home. And for someone who lives in a semi-rural area, I can say in full confidence that it is an insanely isolated feeling being constantly at home all year. Once I had fully realized how bad it had gotten, I decided to make a promise to myself that by the end of 2020, I would start doing driving lessons. I found out online that at 21 years old, I no longer needed the required 120 hours of driving, and instead, once I was ready to go for my driver's license, I could go for it. And so I did. After 20 hours worth of lessons with a driving instructor over a period of 3 months, I was finally ready to do my driver's test. The only problem? I was very, very sick. And I've been sick about 7 times in the last 10 years. I only realized I was sick after waking up in the night before my test and feeling like utter garbage. So in my pre-drive test, I was trying everything not to cough, as any signs of coughing whatsoever, and the tester would have cancelled me due to fears of a certain common worldwide sickness at the time. The strict protocols they were strictly told to follow would have ruined my chances at getting my license. I was so focused on not coughing or showing I was sick instead of actually driving that I almost caused a massive accident in the pre-drive test. This didn't fill me full of confidence before doing the actual test. I now had to focus on concealing my sickness and actually driving the car. However, I did the driver's test sick as a dog, managed to hide it reasonably well, and just barely passed. One more mistake on the test and I would have failed. For the next few days, I was feeling so sick in bed, but I had done it. I had my driver's license. What made it even more satisfying? 2 days later, a snap lockdown in my area was announced, meaning that all driver's tests were cancelled until further notice. I was a test booked 2 days earlier from having to wait even longer to drive. Throughout 2021, I was living the dream.
Join the Olympics.
But this time around, I could leave the house and drive. I drove a lot. I drove to work, and I drove to get the same takeaway dinner every Friday night, instead of getting it ordered to the house. I loved driving, but I wasn't very good at it yet. After 8 months of driving and heaps of near accidents, my luck finally ended. Distracted, I had a head-on collision turning into my street at 5 kilometers an hour. The accident cost me $2,000 and made me drastically change my driving habits. Over the next 5 months, I had improved as a driver, and despite this accident, I realized something. I just really enjoyed driving. Every time I got in the car, I was in my happy place. Everything about it made me feel great. I suddenly realized what everyone had been trying to tell me for years, what the freedom driving offered really meant. I was able to go anywhere I wanted, whenever I wanted. Sure, I was still on Dinosaur Island, but hey, it's a big island. Suddenly, I had the power to go anywhere and do anything. That's what the privilege of driving meant to me. The freedom it opened up for me honestly changed my life. I had finally seen the light. Finally. Those months of being stuck at home, not being able to go anywhere at all, was the final straw that broke my camel back, and I was incredibly driven to take the necessary steps toward getting my life finally moving. I still wasn't perfect, and there were still many more things I wanted to achieve, but when it came to driving, all of those stressful lessons with the instructor and all of those times I felt bad for not being able to go anywhere and people having to come and get me from my place, all of that became a thing of the past. The shame was replaced by sheer joy. About 6 months after my little car accident, I drove to a friend's house that was about 90 minutes away from my place. I stayed there all day for his birthday, and before going out, I had a Long Island iced tea. One of these is about 4 standard drinks. I then went out for dinner with everyone and had a further 3 Long Island iced teas. I was doing pretty well at about 16 standard drinks and felt a little bit drunk, albeit the drinks were spread out over some hours. At 7:53 p.m, I looked at the time on my phone after drinking my 4th and final Long Island, and thought about how it was still early and there was plenty of time to have a big night getting hammered with everyone, but everyone stopped drinking. Some hours later, at 11:20 p.m, we had returned to the house and an argument ensued between me and my friend's girlfriend. We had been arguing pretty much the entire day and the last 2 times we caught up, and clearly we just didn't get along, nor should we have been in the same place as one another at any given time. This argument in particular, though, enraged extreme levels of anger through me, as it was the final straw. I was sick and tired of being made fun of all day. After this, she went to bed and I stayed there for another hour. I was still very angry. I looked at my phone and the time was 12:53 p.m, approximately 5 hours since my last drink, but I had 16 standard drinks that day. Of course, I was just so angry that I didn't care anymore. I was sure as hell not staying the night there. I wanted to be as far away from that house as humanly possible. I decided that I felt completely sober, and after waiting another 30 minutes in my car, I angrily decided to drive home at sometime around 1:20 a.m. on that Tuesday night. What I didn't understand was that despite feeling sober, I was in reality still affected by the alcohol. I had a good tolerance, but I still had all of those drinks that day. I stopped to get food on the way home, thinking that would once and for all extinguish any feeling of effects from the alcohol I thought I could have had. I don't think it did much. crash. I made it home without being stopped and breathalyzed by police. I never thought I'd ever share this story publicly, and only one other person knows about this, the guy who hosted the party. However, the absolute shame and complete disgust I've felt since I did this has prompted me to talk about it. Of course, I completely understand if people watching this video decide to lose all respect for me. Personally, I could no longer live with the shame of this being kept hidden by me and one other person, and I would rather it just be common knowledge. Also, the thought of people liking me whilst not really knowing me, compared to them hating my guts and knowing that I'm human and can do the same stupid shit that bad people do, made it an easier decision for me to decide to reveal this. For so long, I felt so responsible while driving, confident I would never ever drink and drive. And then one event I deemed on that night as an extenuating circumstance of me not wanting to stay at the house of someone I didn't like led to me drink driving. Some of you are probably thinking, it's not that bad. You weren't completely wasted behind the wheel. In my eyes, if you're clearly over the limit, it's drink driving. People call someone very drunk a drink driver, and despite how sober I thought I probably was, I was still the same thing, a drink driver. So when it comes to my personal moral compass, this is probably the worst thing I've ever done. There was no way I was fit to drive. I felt completely sober, but there was no way I actually was. There wasn't any bad driving that night, only complete and utter shame at what I was doing and also anger at what had happened that day. For years I had shamed people while watching cop shows for drink driving, and all of a sudden that was me. I was no better than any other drink driver. I was the loser who got behind the wheel after having that much alcohol on the same day. Never ever drink and drive. I never really fully grasped the ads, but they're right. If you drink and drive, you're a bloody idiot.
Whatever tomorrow brings, I'll be there with open arms and open eyes, yeah.
In the end, in some way, I had to extinguish my shame in order to attempt to move on. Because that's what humans have got to do, right? Move on. I tried forgetting about it, but I never fully could. As of this video's recording, it happened about 6 months and 1 week ago. And this video, I guess, is me finally getting my hidden shame out in the open, but I will forever feel like crap every time I hear about drink driving. It wasn't not getting caught when I should have that made me ashamed. It was that in reality I endangered people's lives. It didn't matter that it was late on a Tuesday night and I drove past only 15 cars, with most of them across a big lane barrier. I still have to live with what I did. But of course, I couldn't hate driving because of this. Of course I still carried around that guilt inside, but I needed to move forward somehow. I still love driving to this day. I still have my license, and no, I've never driven under the influence of alcohol since, and nor will I ever again. I love winding down the windows and feeling the nice breeze driving along an ocean esplanade. I love having friends in the car on road trips, and I love the feeling I get inside when I'm just in my happy place behind the wheel of a car. The point of this video is, once you achieve something and you realize that something is the thing you love with just about every fiber of your being, don't abuse it. The best things in life should be respected, not taken for granted. When it comes to driving, it should be every person's privilege, not their right. I hope everyone watching this finds their heaven in some way with driving, even if you do hate it. And if you or anyone you know is driven drunk behind the wheel and is ashamed, talk about it. Or get them to talk about it. Make it feel more real and accept that it has happened instead of just trying to bury it deep down inside. And always remember, everyone, stay safe out there on the roads.